There's a catastrophic decline in birth rate. Over the course of a couple of hundred years, the birth rate's fallen from 7 or 8 children to about 1.5. And so over time, the population will start to shrink.
It seems counterintuitive. We are the wealthiest, and yet we're not taking that wealth and being like, well, now I can welcome more people into the world.
The cost of a child is, in terms of time, is actually all the other things you could have done with your time. One of the big mistakes in economic analysis is to focus too much on averages, but we know that there are about 5% of people don't fit this trend. So I really wanted to find out, is that relevant? Is it interesting?
Welcome to Edify. My guest today is Dr. Catherine Pakaluk. She is a professor of economics at the Catholic University of America, American economist, social philosopher, and most importantly, my favorite, mother of 8. And we are just here today discussing her book just came out, Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Defying the Birth Dearth. So welcome to Edify.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to this conversation very much. We're both, I believe, what you call super paras. You have 8, 6 adopted.
That's right.
And, 8 yourself, 6 more adopted, and I have 7. So we're going to get into this. Why did we do it? That's the question of the book. But first, I'd like to sort of set the stage for the listeners and try to understand, and this is the backwards of your book, but what is the birth dearth? What are we looking at, just broadly speaking, globally in the United States?
Right. So basically, at this point, a catastrophic decline in birth rates. What do you mean by catastrophic?
Yeah, that's a big word. Yeah.
Catastrophic. No, I won't say precipitous. So precipitous would mean it just happened, yesterday. We'll say over the course of a couple of hundred years, going back to 1800, the birth rate's fallen from what we would say like a typical mom would have been just like us, 7 or 8 children. Today, that number is about 1.5. The official average for the United States is 1.65, so under 2. And so today, when people say catastrophic, what they mean is not as many children as a couple to replace themselves. So fewer than replacement number. Now, that's okay for a bunch of people to be below replacement or a bunch of families or households. But if the typical household in a society has fewer than 2 children, what it means, mathematically is that over time, the population will not only not grow, but it will start to shrink. And globally, we're at the point where many countries have a shrinking population already. And the United States isn't shrinking yet, but we are starting to see a shrinking working age population.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and you said that this trend began over 200 years ago, right?
Yeah.
That it's been declining a long time. I think that's surprising because most people, when they think of the demographic winter, they think of something that began with the sexual revolution and the advent of the pill.
Yes.
Was there a change, though, in the rate of decline, I guess you would call it, when we saw that, I guess, technology, hormonal contraceptives kick in?
Yes, and in fact, the distinction you just made is the one that I think scholars right now have to adjudicate between those two theories. In other words, is the population collapse or decline that we're experiencing today merely the extension of that 200-year process? We call that modernity, call it sort of modern economic growth, or is the experience of countries after the birth control pill something new and different? And there are actually 2 different streams of thought about that. Certainly in terms of birth rates, there is a major inflection point really starting right around 1960. And that is the inflection point when you start to see married mothers with children entering the labor force in large numbers.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you mentioned sort of modern economics. From an economic standpoint, in your training, what is the effect of this kind of depopulation in some countries that we're seeing on even daily life?
Yeah. So we're very close to the beginning of this depopulation. So it's hard to sort of look and say, here's what it will look like at a national level. But I think we've got some idea. So, it might be helpful to think about, those towns in Middle America that we think of as having become kind of ghost towns.
Right, the Rust Belt.
Rust Belt towns, places where, people who had children, the kids grew up and moved someplace else. That's kind of what it looks like, what we expect it to look like. I mean, we don't really know because this kind of depopulation is new to human society. We have reports of what it looks like after the plague wipes out.
I was going to say Europe depopulated, but it was a long time ago.
No, that's right. But any way you look at it, you recognize, even if it's, if you have a plague or a disease wipes out a lot of people, that would be really devastating, or war. But what we should generally think about is kind of what a recession or depression type of situation looks like, with the exception that it's not generated by a lack of jobs as much as it's generated by a lack of people to work. We think about a recession or a depression is the sort of thing where there's not enough economic activity going on, or not enough economic innovation and growth, and you've got willing laborers standing around without jobs to take. So this would be a little bit different. It'd be like there's a need to have businesses and economic, but there aren't workers to fill those jobs.
There's no people, right?
And so little by little, you would think about things kind of closing or adjusting, or and we understand. Some of that may not be dire. People talk about AI and robots being better at what they do, and so maybe you don't have to have a human being doing all the things that we used to have. And so you can cover some of this with technology, but clearly you can't cover all of it.
Yeah, it seems strange to me to something that when I'm talking to young people who are worried about starting a family, worried about having children, something that comes up is, well, am I going to be able to afford them? And it seems like a strange time in history, or counterintuitive in history, that we are the wealthiest. Like, I live better than King Charlemagne ever. I have toothpaste. I have Tylenol. I can like we live very cushy lives. And yet we're not taking that wealth and being like, well, now I can welcome more people into the world because I have these resources. And that is very counterintuitive when I bring up that point to people, and they're like, So why is it that at our wealthiest point in human history, do you think we're not sharing that with the next generation, or even making a next generation?
Right. I love that you highlighted that. That is exactly the thing that we have to dig into. And this is where, as an economist, the notion of opportunity cost is really helpul.
Yeah, talk about that a little. The word.
Yeah. So first of all, just to confirm what you're saying, we are so vastly wealthier than our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents who lived and had much larger families, right? So in the first place, it doesn't stand to reason that we can't have children today because we don't have enough resources, right? That doesn't make a lot of sense, and it doesn't hold water. I mean, obviously, we can afford children. So what's going on? Well, there's sort of two things, I think, at least going on, and this is this notion of opportunity. So the first thing is, as you become wealthier, the kinds of things you can do with your time expand. This is a funny thing. This is part of that. It's part of that thing that you highlighted. Now you have toothpaste but you know what you also have? You've got great vacations. You've got all kinds of things that are within the grasp of ordinary folks. Wouldn't have been in the grasp of ordinary folks in 1900. Second part of that, well, how do you in fact purchase children? Like, how do you purchase children? Now that's a funny way to put it. Well, mostly, okay, there's some expenses for children and things that, I don't want to minimize those things or the hardships of paying for a large family. But the biggest cost of children is your time, right? That is the biggest cost, right? And it's night and day time too, right? It's all night, it's all day, it's all kinds of burdens and sacrifices. So when we go back to that idea that that modernity and economic growth has delivered us all of these modern conveniences, but also has brought down the price of vacations and a certain kind of set of lifestyle opportunities, then what happens is it changes the choice set. right? So
Right.
the cost of a child is, in terms of time, is actually all the other things you could have done with your time. And those things in modernity, they start to look really attractive. It's actually, it's the irony of how good it is. Those things are really good. I don't want to sit here and say those things are bad. They're great. It's wonderful that we've...
I like vacations.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Or hobbies or...
and I wouldn't even want to call any of these things frivolous. We could back away from them. We could say it's not vacations, but it's a clean place to raise your children in a nice neighborhood. It's all the kinds of things that a couple might want to devote time and energy to. But to devote time and energy to those things, you have to pick and choose, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's the way to think about it. Is it's as we become wealthier, the choice set expands. And children, as an option for how we can spend the currency of our time, they shrink as one among not just 5 or 6 things, but now one among 10 or 50 or 100 things that you might want to do before you're 30.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, you speaking of children as such a deliberate choice, and this is. I'm just going to theorize and you can correct me. So this seems to be where modern hormonal contraceptives come in, because children are now, and you talk about this a little in the book, I was really interested, are now a more deliberate choice. Yeah. The default is you sterilize yourself. Yeah. I mean, most of my friends in high school were on some kind of contraceptive. Right. And it's like you stop the spigot and you have to choose to turn it on again when you decide you are ready or whatever, our terminology. Right. And so this idea that children are actually not the default when you get married anymore. Right. That seems like a really radical factor here as well.
Yes. I think the way to think about it is children are opt-in. Yeah. Right? They're not opt-out. It's not, well, you get married, have a bunch of kids, and then sort of decide, you look at your husband and you think, well, we're really kind of overwhelmed. Let's take separate bedrooms now, which we can laugh. That would have been one way to do it.
One way to do it
in the older days.
The only 100% way to do it now, even. So.
Right. So, but this is the inflection point. I mean, this is the inflection point. Is if birth control is good enough, modern hormonal contraceptives are good enough in terms of their efficacy, and they're reversible. Right. So. I mean, you're not permanently sterilized. You're temporarily sterilized. What it does is it makes children opt in. So you have to make that choice. So number one, you have to compare children to all those other things. Once you're making a choice for the children, you have to compare kids to all the other things. And then it seems pretty normal to start to evaluate the right time to start, what are the right numbers of things to have? You hear about those things all the time. I've been reading recently a couple of articles. I think it was in the Atlantic about, how parents don't think the kids should share bedrooms.
Right. Really interesting.
Yeah. Super interesting. Right. So the sort of ratcheting up of kind of the right quality of life to have before that opt-in decision takes place. And, you want to take that last vacation or whatever those things might be. And so it's a very big change to think of children as let's say, the thing that happens by default that you have to opt out of to becoming opt-in.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah. I wanted to switch a little bit gears now to the book, though, because we've been talking about coming at this from an angle of examining, okay, why are people not having so many children? Yeah. But you had sort of an interesting, a new approach to this problem. Can you talk just a little bit about the switch you made when you started planning Hannah's children and talking to women who were, in your words, defying the birth dearth?
Yeah, certainly. This goes back now 5 years. I mean, this is a long project. But the idea was the sort of idea of immunity, or kind of what we think of as being inoculated against something. So when you look at declining birth rates, it could look like especially when you look at how much globally they're converging, it's happening everywhere. it could look almost fatalistic, like this is just the march of time, right? But because of my own personal life and people that I know, if you have a lot of kids, you tend to know other people who have a lot of kids.
Right.
I grew up in a large family. Yes, there's actually a lot of people out there who don't fit this trend. And is that relevant? Is it interesting? Is it helpful? As soon as as an economist, I follow the policy work on this. You've got all these people scratching their heads trying to figure it out. We haven't talked about it, but all over the world, you have governments trying to raise the birth rate. They're so worried about it. So here I am thinking, well, there are these people out there, people like me, and they're having kids. Now, they look a little bit like they're inoculated or immune from this sort of falling birth rate problem. And so I thought, well, is that interesting? Is it important? And what I mean is this. Suppose you thought there were some people somewhere who believed things that were, quaint and bizarre. I mean, maybe, people unwilling to modernize, like, I don't know, like the Amish or something like that. You thought, well, okay, the Amish people don't have a falling birth rate, but, you have to be Amish to be like that. You have to sort of adopt all these things. And so from a policy perspective, you would think, well, what chance do we have of making everybody Amish? We want to do that anyway, right? I mean, so
very low,
right? So or suppose you found a group, in the upper Northwest, and you thought, okay, they have a charismatic, church leader who says, everybody has to have 6 kids, or you're not a good person, right? And so you'd think like, well, that's maybe some kind of cult situation, and it's nice that they do this, but we can't do much with that from an intellectual perspective as we shape policy and ideas. So that was really the question. The number one, we know that there are, about 5% of people don't fit this trend. One of the big mistakes in economic analysis is to focus too much on averages and to miss that actually lots of people, so an average is just the average. So a lot of people have 0 children. That's a really interesting phenomenon, and that's increasing. Is that intentional? Is it accidental? When I started this project, I thought that would be the next group, is to talk to the childless. And so then you've got this upper tail, these people in the big bucket at the top, like who are they? And so I thought, well, this would be really interesting. Let's talk to people who are immune, who seem to be immune, and find out if there's anything that we learn. Do we learn that, you have to kind of adopt this whole alternative way of life, or maybe start to think things that are strange?
Yeah. Do you have to be in a cult to have so many children? Which is sometimes a reaction.
Well, I think a lot of people believe that. But from a policymaker's perspective, if that's where you leave it, you leave that on the table, then you will probably get it wrong about whether or not you can encourage that kind of childbearing.
Yeah. Well, so far, everyone who's trying to fix it seems to be getting it wrong. Right. We have studies coming out of Europe and the Koreas where they're trying all these policies and people are still not having children. Not opting in, as you said. And I think at one point in the book, you describe it as, or maybe this was just me. We'll see. You describe it as wanting to study the healthy. Why would you approach curing a disease by only studying those who are sick? I had one of our producers was telling me about this other study as well of the United States Air Force. When planes would come back from World War II going out into the battlefields, they would be riddled with bullet holes, and so they would fix the airplanes by covering up, by fortifying areas of the planes that the planes came back with these bullet holes there. So they fortify those parts. But they didn't think to study the planes that never came back, One, because they didn't have them. But they didn't.
Interesting.
It's why didn't they come back? That was the more important question. So the more important question in a way is, why are women opting in? As it were. And just a sense of statistics. So you spoke to women who have 5 or more. Were there any other parameters you were looking for in your study?
So I looked for 5 or more. In a sense, the 5 is arbitrary. It could have been 3 or 4. I just wanted to hit a number that was a very clear opt-in. I wanted to hit a number that clearly avoided, I had 2 and then I was trying for a boy or a girl. I really wanted to try to get
Beyond
clearly
that.
intentional childbearing. So that was the high number. Again, very clear. There's no bar in my mind for the right number of children to have. I wanted to find people doing something very different. And I also looked for women who had college educations. Again, not out of any sense of normativity that I think that that's better or correct or right for people, but because of the things we've talked about, particularly opportunity cost, looking from the perspective of the labor market trends, the women with college degrees really represent the kind of the global collision course, I would say, between women's education and falling fertility. And so if you can find exceptions there and you can make sense out of them, you can learn something from them. That's a stronger case to be made, especially when you can only interview 50 or 60 people. So I wouldn't rule out extending those interviews to others in the future. But those were the two main things. And of course, I was looking for married couples.
Yeah, and I think the statistic was less than 5% of American women with a college degree have 5 or more children. And then you get up to 7 or more, and I think it's 1%, right?
That's
so
right.
Very small
That's
group.
Right.
So give us an overview. I enjoyed this book so much. I felt a little seen at some points, which was kind of new and novel for me, reading about fertility and population. I was like, oh, they're actually considering what I'm doing. Praise God. So I think give us just kind of an overview of what you found. I know there are all these particular stories, and I'd love to get into a couple. Yeah. But what were some of the main factors that you found?
Right. Okay. So going back to this language of choice, right? So these are people who are opting in. I guess the main question I had was, are these people sliding into this situation, or is it very intentional? And or are they bullied in, or in some way like caught up in a cult-like situation? I mean, I know what it is for me, right? But I didn't necessarily know what I would find when I dipped into women of other faiths, women in other types of religious communities, women of not very religious. So I really wanted to find out, what does that look like to opt in, and how intentional is this? For instance, when I raise this research topic with people outside of my community, a lot of people say, well, if religious women are having a lot of kids, it's because they don't believe in birth control.
Interesting.
Right? And you're thinking to yourself, okay, I don't think that's true for me. I mean, I don't believe in using artificial birth control, but I know exactly when my children were conceived, and I could have avoided them. Right. So because you might reject a technology doesn't mean, in this case, that your childbearing is thoughtless, right, or irrational. Right. And so that was really the question, was to figure out, is that true for other women besides me and my friends? Or, like I know I didn't have my kids because the Pope said so. Yeah. Right. But that's not a rejection of church authority. It's just it's an understanding of what it means to make a choice. And is that a rational choice? What does that look like? So that's what I was after. And so in a big sense, or kind of from the bird's eye view, what did I find across the board? Well, it's really quite interesting. Number one, I found out that, that everybody else was like me in that sense, that they had very deliberate reasons for what they were up to. And that certainly, with a few exceptions, there were a few women who had said, well, I felt really called to just have as many as I could. That was a very small portion of my sample. These were people who had a very particular belief about the desirability of children. Right. That children were worth wanting, worth making sacrifices for, among the most important things you could organize your life around. Right. So you plan to have your children. You plan in advance to be the sort of person who can be open to the next child. Because why? Because such great worth attached to having a child. So I could then use language like the language I used in the book. Children are a blessing, but not the many blessings. Like you said, toothpaste is a blessing. Yeah. But actually, like among the biggest blessings that we can receive. And so I realized that, okay, all the women I talked to had a different way of putting language around that. But the sense that children are really expressions of divine goodness, that children are like wealth and health, the kinds of things we wouldn't be done having. And I don't know about you, but one of the most common questions I got when I was still having my children was, aren't you done yet?
Are you done?
Are you done?
Yeah.
Are you done?
Yeah.
And I think that question, we're all familiar with that. Are you done yet? First of all, I don't know where that's coming from. And I don't know why people feel so interested in knowing whether you're done.
It's almost universal, though.
It is universal.
I get it after church. I get it on the playground. I get it in the grocery store. Are you done?
Yeah. Are you done?
The doctors, are you
done? And I think that question, which is so common, everybody knows what it is probably the best way to go at the difference between, the type of thing I heard across all women of all the different faiths that I interviewed. Whether or not they were ready to have another child, they all expressed the idea that that children shouldn't be subjected to an "Are you done?" any more than health or wealth. No one would say, "Aren't you done making money? Aren't you done becoming prosperous?" Or, we think about people who try to retire themselves early, but they do so after really achieving a very high net worth, right?
Independent wealth, yeah.
Right. Or people who become persuaded that physical health and fitness and performing physically at a very high level. I mean, you don't watch those people and they go, well, I've kind of made it now. I mean, I'm done. Like I've got no more goals. I've got no more goals. I think that number of this, I mean, I certainly in my extended family, I have family members who are quite devoted to the development of their fitness and physical health. And no, it's admirable, the amount of sacrifices they make, the way they organize their lives around that. But that is the distinctive difference that I found, at least in my sample, was that this is a group of people who, having been persuaded of the value of a lifestyle dedicated to being open to children, don't see children as the sort of thing you would be done having any more than a fitness buff would say, oh, I'm done being in shape now.
Right. It's like they discovered that in the hierarchy of all the goods that we discussed, children are right up there on top.
They're right up there.
Along with, like you said, but even more than health in many, and even more than wealth.
Yes.
There's a lot of financial sacrifices, of course, that we think of.
That's right.
I think I love what you're saying about the cost on our time, because that's the one thing you can't purchase, and you don't know how much of it you actually have, is how much time you have. Right. Or how many children you will be given. Right. And at one point, I think you articulate it. This was in that one of the middle chapters that I just, for me, it was that they found something worth dying for. Yeah. And it seems really drastic to put it in those terms, especially in a culture where we talk about children like a commodity that will acquire eventually. You wouldn't be like, well, my 6-bedroom home is worth dying for. Right. I mean, some people might, but then you can't enjoy it. Right. But what is it about children for these women that makes them worth this sort of death of self? Yeah. Yeah. So that's a really deep question. And of course, I think I only kind of scratch the surface of that. You interview people and you find out, first of all, I think one of the things that became clear if you interview people who have many children is that their attitudes about how they started having children are not always the same as the attitudes I love that.
Towards the end.
Different.
Yeah. But that highlights this kind of the possibility of learning. So you think, and I know this is true for me, you have your first maybe because you think it's right or good, or you think that's what marriage is for, and you're excited and you think, well, it's going to be good, it's going to be great. But as after my first was born, of course, the principles that I believed in, that children were the purpose of my marriage, for instance, that didn't go away or diminish. But all of a sudden there was this extra thing, which was, gosh, like, I think this has been undersold. I mean, this is wonderful. Right? This baby is the best baby in the whole history of the world.
Love, right? It's a person, right? It's a whole person,
right? And so then you live in this community or the structure. You and your spouse share maybe a sense that, well, children are blessings, that you should sort of try to orient your life so that you can be open to more children, and then you're enjoying it so much. So then there's this snowball where there's greater joy and enjoyment Doesn't mean there aren't obstacles along the way, health challenges, and you think like, well, in principle, we'd love to have another one, but I'm not well enough right now. I certainly encountered that. So I'd want to highlight the role maybe of principle, idealism, a kind of confidence in the faith, in the providence of God, which gets people started. But then for many of them, or really for most of them, there was an articulation of a kind of turning point or a tipping point after which, kind of all of the learning, most of the learning had been done, or the hardship,
the steep learning curve
had been accomplished. Yeah. And then you're done sort of learning how to be a mom. You're just enjoying, right? Yeah. So you go like, okay, this is really, I know for me, it was like the number 4. It was sort of, I'm just enjoying this baby so much. And it's not that I wasn't enjoying the first few, but the stresses.
I wasn't enjoying the first few.
Yeah.
It was
the
very
stresses
difficult.
of learning how to care for another person. So I think one of the things that comes out of this piece of this discovery, I guess I would say, is that if you don't live in a culture, or like our subculture, your church, your marriage, your family, your extended family, which orients itself around the blessing of children.
And gives you that confidence.
Yeah, you may actually stop exactly before you realize it could be easier, right? So you never get past that hurdle where you go, oh, actually this gets easier.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, it was funny. Tim Carney, who wrote the wonderful Family Unfriendly book, he had a comment. Someone had posted on social media, on Twitter, of course, and I hate to get into that, but someone had posted a mockery of his book saying like two kids are impossible, and he was like, "You're exactly right. 2 children are impossible because there's too few." Yeah, and you're right. People stop at 2. Yeah, and it seems to me that the moms, then there's this culture of stressed out moms and the mommy wine culture and like Chardonnay all day. And it's the only way to handle the 2. And I want to say to them, like, if you just like keep going, and I think it has to do with the opportunity cost, right? Because those first 2 kids cost more in a way than any subsequent children will. Because at that point, 4, 5, 6.
Yes.
You've already given up the hardest things.
That's right.
I don't know.
I think that's right. Now, I think it's difficult to say that you could just keep going outside of this kind of subculture. I keep stressing, right? This subculture. Right. I deal with it a little bit in the book, but obviously these women have particular views about children, which are unique and interesting. And I mean that in relation to, say, our culture at large, right? Our culture at large believes that there is that you ought to be done at some point, that you should box your childbearing into a couple of years. You have your kids, and then they get to kindergarten, and then you go back to work, or you do whatever. You box things in. That's what our culture at large thinks. So I stress how different that attitude is. I stress that it really has a biblical expression, this very old-fashioned language of children as blessings.
Ancient language,
yes, right. Ancient and biblical. But I also, of course, touch on the fact that their husbands are quite different as well, right? So,
let's talk about the husbands. Yeah,
their husbands are different. Them. In other words, taking the lessons from this book, if one were to try to extrapolate to someone not in that kind of a subculture or outside of a marriage like that, there's a lot of pieces that have to be present, right? I didn't interview the husbands. I heard a little bit about them from different wives, and where there were discussions about their husbands, I tried to include them. But obviously, women who think you can't have too many children, and who organize their lives around that conviction, their husbands are pretty interesting people too.
Yeah, right. That would be a whole nother book.
Yeah. So what that means is that the husbands were, we'll say, supportive of their wives whenever they felt ready or discerned readiness for another child, rather than the husbands, say, guiding or pushing or having a particular number in mind. I think this is another one of these potential myths that is worth exploring or maybe exploding. the knee-jerk reaction of a lot of folks to, the historically larger family sizes is to say this was a patriarchal thing. It was the patriarchy.
He's making her
men want all these children.
Yeah.
Turns out, I did a little bit of research on this. We don't know a lot about what men's basic desire for children. We don't know a lot about women's either, and this is also interesting. It's until you get to an opt-in situation for children that how much people want children isn't a really important question. Once children are completely opt-in, that's when you have to ask, well, how much do people want kids? How much did they ever want kids?
Right.
Or is it just that they really weren't opt-in before? And I don't just mean that people had them, accidentally. I don't necessarily mean that. But I think there are many reasons besides the contraceptive technology that made children not necessarily an opt-in in the way that we think about it today. And what I mean is there are lots of ways in which you needed to have children. We don't need them economically.
Right.
And we don't have to have them if we want to couple up and get married. So the technology is there. You can be married forever and not have any one child. But you can also be married forever and not suffer with no children and not suffer any large economic consequences.
Okay.
And that's sort of, two normal pieces of that. One is that you don't really need extra hands.
Right, like on the farm to help with the cows or something.
On the farm, or, I think about this at home a lot. Like, you don't need extra hands to wash dishes. You don't need extra hands to go get water from the well.
Because you can push a button.
Yes. All of these various tasks of the household don't require extra hands. So you don't think to yourself, well, gosh, like we could have a comfortable life with 2 kids, but man, we'd be so much more comfortable with 5.
Yeah.
I think that's, sort of worth emphasizing. And the other thing, of course, is you don't need to have children to have a comfortable old age, right?
Right. You can buy that.
You can buy that. You can save for it. You can buy it, state pension programs and federal pension programs, Social Security. These all seem like great ideas, but they do sort of chip away at this fundamental sense that, I could have a comfortable retirement with 2 children, but I'd be really a lot more comfortable with 6, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you don't really need kids anymore. So what would be the reason to have them? Well, it would be because you want them, right? So you do things because you need it or you want it. It's pretty simple.
Yeah.
So then this whole question of whether women want children, what are their desires for children? Where does that come from? Do men want children? That becomes a really important question.
Right. Right.
And where would that come from? Where would the desire for children be formed or shaped in us?
Yeah. Let's talk about Lauren. I loved Lauren. So she's kind of the outlier, right? Because most of the women share some kind of, like you said, confidence in God, religious conviction, whether they're Jewish, Mormon, Protestant, Catholic. Lauren and her husband, they're Jewish, but they're not religious, right? She was very insistent that this was not because of some like religious conviction. Right. And for her, it was her husband.
It was her husband, yes.
So tell me a little bit about her, because it is an outlier, but it's a great story.
It's a great story. Yeah. Well, I think it helps to, and I included it in part because that's what you do as a researcher. You include the story which most differs from everybody else, right? So these aren't all women who are saying, children are the greatest blessing from God. So Lauren said, no, no, they're not blessings. And then she sort of said, well, of course they are in a way, but she wasn't after the blessing. That wasn't her motivating. So I included her because it really helps us to see that if you have children, if you choose to have children, you're doing so because there's something that really makes them worthy of desire for you. So for most of the women, right, worthy of desire came from, at least initially, an encounter with some aspect of God's providence. For Lauren, her husband wanted 9 children. Now we don't know. We don't know in the story, nor in my interview, we don't really know what caused her husband to want 9 children. But she knew it when they first started dating, when she met her husband's mom. The mom said, he wants 9 kids, right? And she said, what? It's a great story. We don't know why, but he really wanted children, 9. When I interviewed her, they had 5, and the baby was about 1 year old. So she said, well, we're not sure yet, but of course, he's going to try again. Yeah. It was a really funny story. But I really pressed her because you want to sort of figure out, like, is this a case of, maybe like the husband wants 9, but does she want 9? Well, she doesn't want 9. She said if it had been up to her, she would have stopped at 3. She would have been done at 3. But then what do you call it? Is she being forced into the rest of them? So this is really important, is how you think about that. So she comes to want them in the sense that she chooses, and she says it's absolutely a choice. I've gone along with it. And why does she do that? Well, I press her. Now, you have to sort of see the scene. Lauren and her husband are very wealthy. They were probably among the most well-educated couples that I met. They both had PhDs.
Yeah. She doesn't fit the Gilead Handmaid's Tale stereotype.
No, not at all. She says this is absolutely a choice. She uses a lot of spicy language. And she was really fun to talk to. But I pressed her. I said, well, why do you go along with it? Why have you gone along with it? And she says, look, my husband has a very interesting set of needs in our marriage and our relationship. He doesn't need a lot from me. He doesn't ask for much. He doesn't want me to cook. He prepares his own meals. My recollection is he was kind of a fitness buff, and maybe he was making protein. I mean, I don't know what he was doing. I didn't dive deeper, but she said he doesn't want me to cook for him. He does his own laundry. There are very few things he wants from me. This is something he really wants, and so I thought she said something like, "This is the one thing I can give him." And to me, that's really cool. Really a beautiful, neat thing. So her desire for children, because I think it became her desire. So we talk about the way in which our desires can change. It became her desire in the sense that she made a choice to have that 5th baby. And I haven't followed up with her. Maybe she had a 6th or a 7th. I don't know yet. I probably will follow up. But it came from a choice to want the thing that her husband wanted.
That's really neat to want the thing that he wanted. Yeah. I mean, that's sort of the project of marriage, right? Is to build a life together where you're of such one heart and one mind that you're wanting the same things. Right. Which is like an icon of our relationship with God, right?
That's right.
Really interesting.
And we know from the scripture, God wants children. Yeah. Right.
He's pretty clear about that.
He's pretty clear about that. Yeah. He wants children. And this was something that for me was really a kind of discovery in this process of talking to people. I really do feel that our Jewish sisters articulated it better. And this was something that it very much helped me to process what was going on. You come to want the things that someone you love wants, right? And so God, of course, is an object of love, properly an object of our love. And so this question of like, are children desirable? Should we want them that much? I just loved that. In a sense, maybe it's a way of saying, look, the Catholic Church's engagement with the question of birth control and modernity has been, we'll say, fraught at best. Right? It's fraught in the church. It's fraught
British
outside of the church. Right. That's exactly right. But I've wondered since working on this project if it's been in a sense of distraction. I don't mean by that to say that the teaching isn't important or worth exploring or worth understanding, but that it's been a distraction from something that is, in a sense, more ancient and more important, which is, that God wants children. Right. Now, that doesn't mean he wants us to shut off our reason and not to cooperate lovingly and willingly. Like, he doesn't want our yes. He does want our yes, right? He proposes. He doesn't impose. Those things are really important. But there is a fundamental question about whether children are worth wanting. And the more I talked to people and the more I thought about the history of both Christianity and the church's struggling with this question, the more I realized that the most important question is how desirable are children? And I think in this moment, when it's very easy to not have children, that it's much more important to figure out the answer to that. Right? Yeah. Why are children worth having? Why are they worth having even in less than ideal circumstances? Why is applying circumstances of life, we now will say quality of life tests, and you can start to see how much this question about childbearing and family, actually it spills over into this question of the pro-life culture. right? Quality of
Right.
life versus sanctity of life. And I think that that's the dividing line. I mean, that's like how we adjudicate between the desirability of life and God as the author of life and what God wants, how we
Right.
adjudicate between that and our kind of human standards.
Right.
Right.
And this is probably where the policy that modern governments are trying to turn around the birth dearth is
Yeah.
almost doomed to failure, right? Because I think what I hear you saying is that if a man and a woman live their life together with sort of the horizon isn't death, the horizon is eternity, that's what's going to make children worthwhile, because it's that conviction that, and again, Lauren is always in the back of my head as the little voice, like it's not all about that, but the conviction that, and I think for her too, right, that love of her husband, that there's something eternal and good and above all other goods there, that would make them worth having. Just to give like a broad historical stroke, because what you were saying about sort of the birth control question with the Catholic Church, everyone thinks of Humanae Vitae in 1968. They're like, okay, well, that's when the church like came down with the birth. But I think the violence of the reaction to that, even within the church. I mean, you're at Catholic University, right?
Yes,
where Father Curran was. There's the rebellion,
the revolt against Humanae
total
Vitae,
revolt against the church teaching,
largely launched from my campus,
right? But that revolt wouldn't have happened if Catholics writ large and the church writ large had not lost already, perhaps over hundreds of years, the sense of why children are so worthy of so much sacrifice,
right?
So tying that into like the growth of modernity, how did we get to a place where you have this like 5% of women who see the value and 95%, even within the church, who don't?
Right. So I think this is a really, as I think it's a really deep question, and I think this is why I like to say that focusing on the last 20 years is not really the action here, where the action is. I think it's possible to outline a very ancient revolt against God, which is a revolt against the child. It's also a revolt against the body, right? So you think about like the Gnostic heresies, which are a revolt against the body. And many of the Gnostics thought, childbearing wasn't worth doing, right?
Right.
You can think about something closer to present time, kind of Thomas Malthus, and all of the people that Malthus inspired, people like Charles Darwin, and then the modern eugenicists. Obviously that view attempts to substitute a kind of human reasoning about the progress of human life and the desirability of the growth of the population. Substitute a human reason, a human kind of rationality. Like when you read Malthus's essay on population, for a minute you kind of go, well, heck, this makes sense.
Right.
Like,
because it's a calculation.
Maybe he got the numbers wrong about, how many how many hectares of land it would take to grow X numbers of vegetables or wheat. But, surely he's right. At some point, there's a limit, right? This is kind of lifeboat idea.
Yeah, zero-sum game.
At some point. And so this is, but I would say, like, historically, this is bound up with this, this really, I think it's the struggle. I think after having written this book, I think it's important to draw out the two two fundamental views of human life. One which attempts to substitute human rationality in each time and place, right? So in Malthus's day, it's we can't grow food fast enough. Famine and disease will, constantly plague us. In our time, it's maybe the climate or the global climate, the carbon
population
footprint.
bomb kind of mentality. Right?
I mean, the population bomb, of course, said, well, there's going to be all this famine, and it's still now it's like, well, it might not be people that are damaged by more people. It'll be the actual planet which will be damaged. I mean, so, but you can just find this thread. So the point is, I mean, there's nothing new under the sun. But I'm struck by the fact that the incarnation of Jesus Christ in God's providence and his love, it didn't involve it didn't involve the second person of the Blessed Trinity coming to earth as a fully formed man, right? And this is really important. So he comes to earth as an embryo, first in his mother's womb, and then as a child. And actually, it's a matter of faith and a specific. There's a specific content of our faith that actually we could get on the ground and worship an infant,
right?
And I think that says something very deep about the desirability of children. And you can think about in a sense, the whole progress of Christianity as boiling down to that.
Yeah.
Can you worship a God who's an infant?
And I was listening to Louise Perry. I think you were on her podcast. And obviously she's not herself a believer. I think she's close.
Yeah, she's engaging with Christianity.
Yeah, she's
deeply.
engaging deeply, and she's a thinker. But she was saying one of the markers of Christian civilizations that archaeologists and anthropologists will find is that in pre-Christian, post-Christian, in non-Christian civilizations, you'll find pits of the bodies of children, of the throwaway children.
Yeah.
And it switches when those pits disappear, dry up, because it's a mark of the Judeo-Christian that the child is to be honored. Yep. And you think, of course, of Christ with like the least of these, and bring the children unto me. And that it took a revelation of God to show that to us. Like reason seems to have failed, because you think of even the Greek and Roman societies who achieved this sort of pinnacle of human rationality, reaching toward the truth. They still sacrificed infants, and they still exposed female babies that they didn't want. Right. The Mayan, they just found the pit of the Mayan boys. And
exactly.
It's the radicality there. I think it plays out in Hannah's children. Yeah. You see that.
I think it's a temptation to view history progressively. I think we're always prone to that. And one of the features of that is to wipe away or sort of ignore these obvious counterpoints that you're mentioning, that the babies have not always been desirable. And in fact, if we just take a patient view, many pagan and non-Christian cultures have just been happy to dispose of children. Or to use children to satisfy other means. So think about them, or other ends, think about children as very instrumental to adult desires and wishes. We should not cast that aside as like not part of the story of what we're facing today. Right?
Brilliant. Yeah. That's really interesting. So again, to switch gears, this is, so drawing, I think, the spiritual currents that are going on here. When we turn to something like, okay, how do we fix the problem? I work in a political advocacy organization, very pragmatic. Yeah. Okay, so what do we do about it? On the one hand, it seems, well, if we live in such a pluralistic society where, a lot of Catholics themselves are sort of Gnostics, how do we then form public policy to encourage children? So we could talk about what's not working, and then maybe what you think would be a direction.
Right. I think that what hasn't worked largely, and it's not to beat up on things that have been tried. Certainly, I would say we could extend out 30 to 40 years, and not in this country primarily, but we can look at countries that knew they had a kind of a demographic winter coming,
a problem,
and they've tried different things. So we could point to the Koreas, vast parts of South Asia. Australia has tried some very significant things, and then all across Western Europe, countries have tried different things. Now, generally, what can you try? Well, policy aimed at raising birth rates or encouraging fertility it's kind of limited, so we have this kind of bundle of things, and, basically the bundle of things is, taxes and credits and subsidies, and that bundle of things is largely what's been tried. There's been a few sort of in-kind types of benefits, like extra maternity leave or things like that that are not quite the same as a tax or a tax credit or a subsidy. But largely you're looking at that bundle of types of things. And, largely the news is it hasn't really worked.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the first piece.
So is it hopeless?
Well, I don't think it's hopeless, but I think that those responses rested on a misdiagnosis of the problem, right? So going back to what we've discussed, if the problem is that children aren't in a pagan culture, they aren't desirable,
right?
Or it's difficult to see what the upsides of devoting a tremendous part of your life to childbearing would be, then that's where you have to attack the problem. And so, it could be that there are people out there kind of constrained on the margin who, but for an extra tax break, would have 3 or 4 more children. And there's going to be a few people like that. But as we've seen, it can't be that people who are vastly wealthier than in the past are all vastly unable to afford children. That can't be true. So you really have to diagnose the problem as a demand problem. Now that demand economists say demand, but a desire problem or the desirability of children. And on that point, I think governments are, they are a little bit more, their hands are tied a little bit more. But I don't think it's hopeless at all once the problem is diagnosed properly. So what I mean is, what can governments do to encourage and help promote or help religious communities thrive where children are being welcomed and affirmed? I like to call them living religious communities. I found these kinds of living religious communities among women and men of many faiths. So it's not one particular faith. It's clearly not, the Catholic Church alone is where you find families today. I found, so women of many, many faiths. So how do you know when you have a church or you're looking at a church where children are welcomed and people are arranging their lives to welcome children? You look at the growth of that church. Right? We all see this in the Catholic Church. You can look at parishes that are dying, and you can look at parishes that are growing. They're living. They're thriving. And it turns out that this is true across many other faiths as well. Right? There are Jewish synagogues and temples built around rabbis where the populations are growing and people are okay. So could from a political perspective, could policymakers sit down and think, well, what could we do to, this is vital. This is where the births are coming from. What could we do to sort of make life better for these churches? Or are there ways in which we're getting in the way?
Yeah.
Are there ways in which we're hindering? So what are the obstacles? So on that financial point, people talk about this a lot. Are there penalties in the tax code which make marriage like a kind of a bad deal for people?
Right.
Are there other types of things? Are there Tim Carney talks about this. Are there penalties in the tax system so that couples with no children are treated differently from couples with children? So we want to remove those obstacles, but we should think much more broadly about living religious communities and ask: are we putting up obstacles? For instance, just suppose hypothetical that many of these living religious communities would like to undertake the education of young people and make it easier for parents to pass on their values by setting up schools. Are we making that easy or very difficult?
And I'm from Connecticut, and it's very difficult. I'm going to testify.
Actually, we've set up, maybe we're beginning to see the unwinding of this, but we've set up now for almost 100 years a very, very entrenched public monopoly of the funds dedicated to education. So the interesting angle in this would be to say, well, okay, so maybe, now these things go under the heading of educational freedom or school choice. Those things may be good for education simpliciter, and they probably are. Kids might learn math better, right? If these were better schools or whatever. But maybe they're also part of family policy or how we think about encouraging the birth rate.
Yeah.
Not in a direct way. We're not saying, if you have more kids, you'll get more carrots, right? But it's sort of like we're going to encourage and make it easier for these communities to do their work of helping to form values. Because that's the value. When we say value, that's what we mean. What do you want?
Right.
What do you desire?
Right. And I think, too, sort of expanding the notion of having children as my individual choice. Well, yeah, in the end, it is you're opting in as an individual, but so many women are given, they feel like they have a green light when the community around them is supportive of it.
Right.
And you're not some weird outlier with like your 4th pregnancy.
Right.
Very much so. Yeah, I just had to ask you about this quote. So this is from a talk you gave at the Q&A. He said, to the extent that the modern state takes on the job of education, she's competing with the church. She should stop educating children. And I think you were in a very friendly environment there. But I was like, yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah. So I think we could, I'm willing to expand that right now. Expand that point, which is we have modernity, and, maybe this was unintentional. I'm not prepared to sort of craft a big narrative about it. But a feature of the life we live, the United States as it is that we all live in today, this exact minute, we've spiritualized churches and living religious communities in a way that I think has done them damage. So what do I mean by that? Well, the job of vis-a-vis society, the job of churches, in a sense, what is that? Well, actually, we'd want to go back to the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. Right. So something like education is both a corporal and a spiritual work of mercy. Many things are both of those things. So the works of mercy, we'll say corporal and spiritual. So alleviating ignorance is a spiritual work of mercy. But obviously, we'd want to turn quickly to helping the poor.
Right. Feed the hungry, clothe the naked.
Yeah.
Drink to the thirsty.
Yeah.
Right.
Helping people get better who are sick, like healthcare. Exactly. So these are all works of mercy. I think these are the jobs of the church. They're jobs of the people of God. Okay. Well, if you look around today, where would you go if you were sick? Nobody would say you go down to the Sisters of Mercy down the street.
Right.
You'd go to whatever, Lumen Health System or whatever, whatever one's close. So if you think about it, what we've done is, it's all kinds of threads of reasons why these things occurred. But
long story.
Ultimately, what's left to the church is basically just the spiritual, an hour on Sunday. But there's no other need in your life that you need from the church. And so what this has meant, I think, is that churches, religious communities are kneecapped.
Yeah.
Right. So they're supposed to shape people's values without meeting people's needs.
And they're so tied up that even the ministries that the church continues to perform, we were talking about this with higher education, right? With the universities, with the hospital systems that we still retain, what few, now they're struggling too, in many cases. They are themselves so tied up with the secular state for funding that they've kind of had been forced to divorce the spiritual from the corporal. And not even forced. Sometimes it's welcomed, unfortunately. But I think, and this too comes across in the warping of the concept of religious freedom, that we see, especially from the Obama era, where he's like, yeah, I'm all for religious freedom. But what he meant was for the hour on Sunday, you're in the church building, you can say and do your religion.
That's right.
But if you're a doctor in a hospital, don't you dare bring that out into the public square. Which it's such a bastardization of what healthcare is, which is a work of mercy. And I think it's a really important point.
So all the things that are bound up with what we call the welfare state, in a sense, the things we call the Christian democracy or social democracy, kind of extending now to sort of a set of ideas built around what the political economic apparatus should be doing, what we do with our taxes, how we, and this is a question: is the life and health of churches, immune from or able to thrive just as well in a setting where all of the works of mercy are sort of taken on by the state? And I think we'd have to start to question that. Yeah.
And we see schools starting to get out of the FAFSA or trying to start that process, but it's going to be a long time because we were so entrenched in it. And I think, politicians take note. We see also that direct causal line between high lifetime fertility and whether you're going to go Democrat or Republican. Right? And so I think it behooves Republicans, even if they don't share our religious convictions about children, to see kind of where their constituency is. We know that higher fertility families tend to go red, the red diaper babies, right? And
no, that's right. The goal is to try to think about policy or the promotion of family in a less individualistic way instead of, what can we, like, it's as if this.
We'll give this woman $1,000 a year and she'll have a baby. Right.
Precisely. We have to think about the whole proposition in which that decision gets made and how families work. And this requires us to think, I think, with the church a little bit more closely about what the substance of society looks like, right? So it's not just these like lone families out there, like this sort of like out on the frontier. Or we would say if we imagined every family was out on the edge of the frontier by themselves, we just have to send money, send supplies.
Right.
Right?
Angles, they just need antibiotics. Just send them
antibiotics, exactly. But we're sort of treating all the families that are not on the frontier as if they might be just making that decision on their own. But there's a kind of way in which things that seem impossible considered on one's own become super rational, and very feasible, given like a structure of beliefs and a structure of support. And this is what living religious communities provide people. They're not on the frontier.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We're not on the frontier. And that's a very Catholic conviction, right?
Yeah.
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 All right. Well, this has been really lovely. I could probably go on for another hour, but I think we are heading into the time. But thank you so much. Again, if you want to check out Hannah's Children, available wherever books are sold. And also I'd highly recommend any of Dr. Pakaluk's interviews. You can find them all over. Really fun to listen to different angles and different questions that she's answered through the years. We didn't even get to Edith Stein, so we'll have to do this again.
Next time.
All right. Sounds good.
Thank you.
Thank you.